Got it. You record
Welcome.
video or just audio?
Both video and audio. Welcome, everybody. We're now on the final part of the fundamental and insightful series on Rabbinic mysticism. And the last two classes, well, the last class and this class will be on how it differs with medieval Kabbalah in practice and content. Hacham, thank you so much for being here again. Hanukkah Sameach to all. And B'chavod, the stage is yours.
Okay, very good. So, folks, this is the final out of 4 classes on Rabbinic mysticism and compare and contrast with Kabbalah, which is about half of today's class. But first, I wanted to finish the stories about Arba'an Nichnesu LaPardes, which is the Tosefta and Talmud Bavli in Masechet Hagigah, chapter 2. That's the famous source for the entire source for Rabbinic mysticism. As I mentioned in passing, but I'll now illustrate it with a Talmudic story, both Torah and mysticism require individuation. Individuation is a Jungian term, but it means finding your unique perspective and being able to express it. And you'll see how. So there's a story by Rab. This is mentioned in Masechet Menachot 29b. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Amar. This relates one of those many stories that tries to paint different aspects of Moses' experience on Har Sinai. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Amar. Very many imrot are transmitted to Yeshivat Pumbedita. No, this is Yeshivat Sura by his student Rabbi Yehuda. Sha'a sha'ala Moshe Marom. So when Moses goes up to Mount Sinai, he finds God sitting. Sitting is important. We're going to see it later tonight, but it means it's a sense of authority. Only someone with authority can sit in rabbinic thinking. And he was tying crowns to the letters of the Torah. So what does that mean? There are things that are not explicit in the Torah, but the astute person someday can get out of the Torah by comparing and connecting. That's what kosher, ketarim la'otiot. The otiot have, sometimes they have, or some of them have ketarim, little zayins that adorn them. And by connecting or tying together different adornments of the text, not the explicit text, but let's say the subtext, you can develop a form of the mitzvah, you can better understand the mitzvah or the mitzvot as a whole. So God is doing this. But that means that they're not explicit. He is just making connections, not disclosing them. Amar lefanav. So Moses says, Ribono shel olam, mi me'akeb al yadecha. Who's stopping you from actually writing explicit pisukim about these connections, about these further elaborations for us of the Torah? Amar lo, God responds, Adam echad yesh she'atid lihyot besof kamad dorot va'akiba ben Yosef shemo she'atid lidrosh al kos v'kos tilin shel halachot. So, as usual for studying Torah, there often is a agricultural reference. So there's going to be somebody after many, many generations, far in the future, far beyond your horizon, Moses. His name is Akiva ben Yosef. And he is going to be able to doresh, means to investigate and transmit on every little kos, means like those little zayins you see that are part of the crowns of the letters. Tilin shel halachot. Rows and rows, but a tilin is like a term used when you have a orchard or a field and you make rows and each row grows a different vegetable or fruit. That's tilin. Tilin, like Tel Aviv, tilin, of halachot. So he's going to be able to find within the subtext of the Torah or the connections between what appears to be nothing but an external detail of the Torah, many, many halachot. Will he be legislating? Yeah, he's legislating. That's what it means. It's not deep in there. It takes a human operating with the Torah to generate. That's why Moses could not at the time. Amar lefanav, Ribono shel olam, erehuli, Moses says, would you please show this man to me? Amar lo hazor le'achorech. Turn around. Halach v'yashav b'sof shemuna shav shurot. So he was, prophetically transported to the Bet Midrash of Rabbi Akiva, circa 100, let's say, AD. And he sits in the end, means the last seat of the 8 rows. There used to be 8 rows of students in Bet Midrash. And at the last row, in the last seat, Moses goes and sits. But he had no clue what they were talking about. He got weak. Psychologically, he was traumatized. But when Rabbi Akiva got to one particular topic, his students said to him, Rabbi, where is this from? What's the source of this? Amar lahen, Rabbi Akiva said, halacha l'Moshe Sinai. This is a halacha l'Moshe Sinai. Nityashiv da'ato. Moses' mind was calmed. But notice he heard what was being discussed and later labeled halacha l'Moshe Sinai, but he did not comprehend it. So that tells you a few things. One of which is the famous rabbinic, let's say, Seter Torah, that halacha l'Moshe Sinai is not literally, it's not a historical term, it's a legal category. Almost all of the halachot l'Moshe Sinai that I know of were not transmitted by Moses, and that makes sense here. Rashi on this page has a problem, so he says, oh, this vision happened before this halacha was given to Moses, but that's a stretch, and a needless one. The Hachamim take the text, that's what God is telling Moses. You're great, Moses. You're the greatest Navi who ever was and ever will be. And still, you have to wait for Rabbi Akiva to apply his particular time and space and his particular individuality to be able to generate these rows and rows and rows of piles of halachot. You can't do it. It's not that it's hidden in the Torah and you're not capable of finding it. It's pointed to in the Torah, and you don't know how to make those connections for your context, because for your context, everything is more or less explicit. So to be functional, a truth must be historically bound. There's a truth at a certain point in history and a truth about the same book, different one in a later point in history. Because the truth that the Torah teaches is continuously unfolding, people in an early historical period cannot fathom its future development and application. Just like in our own lives, what you knew at age 28 is really different than what you know at age 68. And there's no way your 28-year-old self could ever know what you know at 68. And you have to be realize that happens, and humans change with time, and generations change with time. And that's why individuality and individuation is necessary, not only for studying Torah, but of course for studying mysticism. So where we left off, we studied the encounter between Rabbi Elazar ben Arach and the perfect, successful transmission of the Rashi Perakim and weaving them together in the 2 stages of Petihah and Harsa'ah of Elazar ben Arach with Yohanan ben Zakkai. Now we have 4 who entered the Pardes together. First of all, that should set off a red flag. You're not supposed to do it together. And apparently they kind of did it themselves, although Rabbi Yehoshua was present, Rabbi Yehoshua being a student of Rabban Yohanan ben Zakkai. But it wasn't the same direct transmission as was the case between Rabban Yohanan ben Zakkai and Rabbi Elazar ben Arach. This is the second story in Masechet Hagigah and final. And now we see what happens. Arba'a nichnesu lapardes. 4 entered the orchard. It's called an orchard because that's where you go to grow and nurture the little nitiot that your teacher scattered in front of you in a casual way, not in an organized way. It has nothing whatsoever to do with what they tell you. Pardes is an acronym for Peshad, Remez, Dirash. So absolutely not. That's made up in the, I don't know when, the 12th century. It first appears in the Zohar, I believe. But the original text was not Pardes, it was Kerem. For whatever reason, when they formulated Mishnah Hagigah and Tosefta Hagigah, they changed the word to Pardes. Why, I don't know. But it's a Persian word. What does it mean? Maybe this is why. It means the king's garden, a special garden that the king has. That's where paradise comes from. It's a totally Persian word. It's not an acronym. Ben Azai, I call it Ben Azai. Most people say Ben Azai, but you should not put a dagesh in that zayin. It means someone from Aza. He was a gazin, not to be confused with gazzed up, but he was a gazin. Ben Azai, Ben Zoma, Aher, Rabbi Akiva. Now, these were all great hachamim. I mean, super hachamim. Ben Azai, Ben Shimon, Ben Zoma was he succeeded in convincing his colleagues that we should recite Yisiat Mitzrayim Balelot, as we all recite in the Haggadah and in the Halacha He in chapter 1 of Berachot. Aher, Elisha ben Abuya, was the teacher of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Akiva, you all know about him. Ehad, Hisis, Vamet. Lehasis means to peak. Like in Shir HaShirim, Mesis, Mina Harakim. It means to peek, not to look directly. Generally, it means to peek at something you shouldn't be looking at. And it's a kind of a quick, unorderly looking. One peaked and died. Another peaked and became mentally ill. He went crazy. One peaked and cut those young saplings that the Hachamim had planted in him. And one went up in peace and went down in peace. Now we're going to explain all this. Ben Azai died. Now the Hachamim say in the middle of his dirasha, without being able to finish it. And that was kind of rahmanut on him, because he was twisting his mind in places it shouldn't go. And to save him, to have an uncomplicated or untainted olam haba, he was killed in the middle of that bad dirasha. This is dirasha, obviously. The real pishat is something else. But the Hachamim used this pasuk to say, he who is precious in God's eyes is killed as an act of hesed. Ben Zoma, Hisis Benifka. Ben Zoma, he peaked and he was touched, means he was like injured. Allah vekatuv omer, Tebashmasata echol dayeka pentis ba'inu bahaketo. It's from Mishle. If you find honey, just eat enough that satisfies you. Dayeka. Now honey is sweet. So like we know kids, if you give them candy, they'll keep eating more candy, even though they're not hungry. And the more they eat, the worse the stomach feels. And even the first few candy bars that you could have been satisfied with and you were hungry for, that experience is now tainted because you get sick, you go on a sugar high. Pentis ba'anu, lest you be satiated. So if you're already satiated, you've eaten too much. Just eat enough. Just eat enough. When you're in the middle of eating, sometimes you don't know where the point of satiety is. So you should be careful about that. Because if you become satisfied, you will throw up all of it. And now you're worse off than you were. Not only you don't have the honey, but now your stomach is in a mess and you still need to eat again and everything's tuerto, as we say in Ladino, or means twisted. Elisha, Elisha Aher, he peaked and he cut the saplings that were planted in his mind by the Hachamim as a, surba merabanan and a Hacham, etc., before coming to the Pardes. That's a problem. Alav hekatub omer al titenet picha lahatiet besarecha. This is from Kohelet. Don't let your mouth cause your flesh to sin. It's a derasha. It means something else in Kohelet. Close, but not this. What they mean here is, when you have a mystical vision, whether or not you say it out loud you're articulating it to yourself. You're saying, aha, this means XYZ. Once you say that, there's a temptation to get locked to those words, what Hacham Fa'ur used to call logocentrism. Once you hear the word, you're kind of stuck in that one meaning of the word, and you're less flexible. So if you're eating too much, means you're peaking too much at the mystical vision. You just can't help yourself. You like the sugar taste of it. You may end up koses banityaot. And that's why the pasuk says, don't let your mouth cause your entire being to sin. And that's what he did. The last one succeeded. Rabbi Akiva, Allah b'shalom, yarad b'shalom. Why do we say Allah and yarad? These are the same verbs which parallel the vision of Yaakov. This particular model is referring to what the Hachamim called descent into the Merkava, Yerida la Merkava. They imagine in their mind, this is all after the temple was destroyed, but they would picture in their mind going to the attic above the Kodesh HaKodashim, which is Aliyah, and descending down very carefully without looking to the side, just like those people, those workers, they used to be lowered into the Kodesh HaKodashim to clean. They had like a porthole. So you imagine you're in an elevator, they lower you in the elevator, you don't even open the doors, but there's like a hole and you can reach your hand through the hole and focus just on what's in front of you. Now, you could peek and look towards the side, things you're not there to clean. You just want to see the sights to see. That's a mistake. Like the kirubim. If you're not cleaning the kirubim, you shouldn't peek. And so the mashal is used for those who descend into the Merkava, which in their mind was to descend into the Debir, the Kodesh HaKodashim. That's why we use these verbs. Allah v'katub omer, and here's by contrast to all the others. They peeked, he didn't peek. Moreover, he only went in a direction that his entire soul knew he was being pulled. Moshcheni aharecha narusa. So that's the pasuk. He's telling God, where you pull me, then and only then I will follow you. I'll run after you. I want it, but I'm not going to go in a direction you're not letting me go. So that was restraint. The whole point of this story is you must exercise restraint when you're in the Pardes, because there is no way to know how you're going to be tempted. And temptation, mental temptation, is a part of the mystical vision. And you have to have control while you're in it, or you could end up in a terrible end. There's a similar thing. This is in the Babli. This is the Tosefta. But in the Babli, we have a Baraita which is more or less like this one, not the same. And therefore, it's introduced with one of these Baraita indicators, Tanu Rabbanan. Arba'a nichnesu bapardes ve'elohen ben Azai ben Zoma acher Rabbi Akiva. Now, this is why I'm quoting this here. I won't repeat the stuff that's identical. Amar lahem Rabbi Akiva. So Rabbi Akiva was kind of like the team captain. They were more or less his peers. It wasn't a traditional student-teacher relationship, but he was like the leader, of course, of sorts. So he said, when you get to the stones of pure marble, al tomeru mayim mayim, don't say mayim mayim. We'll explain what this means in a minute. Mishum shene'emar dober shekarim lo yikol leneged aynai. He who speaks lies cannot be seated in front of my eyes. Means if you want to see something about Borei Olam and his ma'asim, you can't be a liar, which means you can't make serious errors, in this case in Ma'aseh Bereshit, but we'll see what that means. This uses a slightly different lashon, Rabbi Akiva, nichnas b'shalom v'yasa b'shalom. That's more referring to the mental journey, not to this mashal of going above the Kodesh HaKodashim in the Aliyah and being lowered in. He entered b'shalom, which means he did his harsa'ah, his Petiha was Bishalom, ended well. And also, he left Bishalom. Sha'alu Ben Zoma. Now, here's what did they see? So we all know that they came to a horrible end and Ben Zoma went crazy. What happened to him? So here you see, they asked him, must be the other three during this collective experience. Mahu lesarose kalba. Is it mutar to castrate a dog? Amar lahem ubartsechem lo ta'asu kol shebe'arsechem lo ta'asu. So that sounds like an innocuous comment. There's a pasuk in Vayikra about the korbanot. Here it is. Uma'uf bechatut benatuk becharut lo takrivu l'Adonai ubartsechem lo ta'asu. You cannot offer as a korban any animal that is their reproductive system is destroyed for whatever reason. Not only that, it can't be used at the temple. Ubar sechem, outside the temple, lo ta'asu, you shouldn't do it. Means you can't make castrate animals at all. So what did we do with bulls? We never had a thing as a gelding horse or a ox, which means a bull who's been castrated. So we had to learn by force of necessity of these mitzvot how to be bull whisperers and horse whisperers. We had to be able to calm psychologically a regular stallion with full of testosterone and a bull full of testosterone, and we were able to understand how to do that. And this mitzvah forced us. That's a side point though. So why are you asking Ben Zoma in the Pardes about Saruse Kalba? So you heard this thing, etnan zona umhir keleb, the price or the pay of a whore and the cost of a dog cannot be used to donate to the temple. Now, as far as our halacha is concerned, we take keleb literally, but the real meaning, the original meaning of a kalba was a homosexual prostitute, a man who played a woman. And that was what he was offering. And so just like the fare or hire of a female prostitute cannot be donated to the mikdash, nor can the hire of a homosexual prostitute. And maybe they would castrate them so that the role would be better played. So they're asking him about sexuality in a way. Now, why is that? Because when you enter the Pardes, you must use your entire soul, including your unconscious. And part of apophasis that I've been talking about for the first 3 classes is to cleanse your unconscious in a certain way of certain archetypes or imaginations. If they're still in your mind, because the experience, the mystical experience is so profound and it permeates your entire soul, if you have what Carl Jung calls archetypes in your deep unconscious that you've suppressed, thinking that you're a rationalist, and I'm an intellectual Jew, and I'm a critical reader, and all you did is shove them down because you never critically read your own soul, your own psyche. You're too busy reading external books and making explanations. Wonderful, but that has a negative. If you go into the mystical experience like that, they will come up to the surface and occlude your vision. And that's what happened. More. Tanu Rabbanan, another Ma'aseh Rabbi Yehoshua ben Hananiah, Shehaya Omed al Gab Ma'ala Behar Habayit Vera'uhu ben Zoma Velo Amal Milefanav. So this was happening at the very same time that the Arba'an Nichnasu LaPardes. So Rabbi Yehoshua, therefore, we get the hint, he's kind of overseeing, but he's not doing the traditional transmission. He's on a ma'ala in the Har Habayit. So I think a high place. He's getting ready to descend to the Merkava himself. And he sees Ben Zoma, and Ben Zoma, who's his student, didn't stand in front of Rabbi Yehoshua. Amar lo me'ayin will ayin Ben Zoma. So Rabbi Yehoshua tells him, where are you coming from and where are you going? As we say in Arabic, min wen lewen Ben Zoma. Amar lo sofe hayiti. I was looking, that's a term that means you say sofe b'merkava, sipiya b'merkava, to look at mystical subjects. I was looking ben mayim ha'arlyonim lemayim ha'tachtonim. You know, in the original creation story in Bereshit, after the rakia is established, there is mayim above the rakia and mayim below the rakia, which refers to earth, right? It could refer to many, many planets in the universe, but from the point of view of our story, we only know about, at that point, we only know there's a planet like Earth with people on it, etc. So I was looking, considering, it means in Ma'aseh Bereshit, what's the difference between the upper waters and the lower waters? You remember from the Pesukim, they're separated. So that means something happened. They're no longer identical. They're no longer both pieces of the original Mayim. Neither of them is the original Mayim, but they both morphed into something else. And there's no difference, there's no distance between them except shalosh esfa'ot. It's like nothing, right? Shneimar, Veruach Elohim merachefet al pnei hamayim kalyona shemerachefet al banea ve'ena nocha'at. So he took the word merachefet, which means hovering, but that's the original mayim. That's not the mayim after the change, or after the Havdalah. He takes that as like a dove that hovers over her babies but doesn't touch the nest. So what is the problem here? Ben Zoma is positing that there's only a geographic distance, and a minimal one of that, between the Mayim Ha'elyonim, which became something else, and the Mayim HaTachmanim, which is like water on the planet Earth. That's a mistake. They underwent a substantive change. They're of a different quality completely. Rabbi Yehoshua said to his students, who would that be? The other three, right? So we get from this story that the four they weren't just cowboys, they marched in all on their own. Somehow Rabbi Yehoshua is tutoring them, but he's giving them a wide berth. That's what's going on in this particular mystical transmission. Adayin Ben Zoma Bahos. Ben Zoma is still outside, which means he's not going to get into the temple precinct, let alone the Kodesh HaKodashim. He's not gonna make it. He's not properly prepared. Ben Zoma succeeded in entering the orchard, but failed to find the temple's gate. The topic of his opening dialogue, therefore, if you can't get through the gate, the sha'ar of the Bet HaMikdash, you're not going to get into the Kodesh HaKodashim. The topic of his opening dialogue was the separation between the waters taking place on the second day of creation. When he was asked by Rabbi Yehoshua to explicate, he dwelt on the distance between the waters. According to Harambam, the mistake consisted in believing that the separation between the upper and lower waters was only spatial, both retaining the same original nature. In reality, their separation involved a radical change in their respective natures, just like the separation of light and darkness, or and Hoshech on the first day. Out of whatever was originally called Mayim, different substances were created. Rabbi Akiva's warning, when you reach marble stones, do not say Mayim, Mayim, was to correct Ben Zoma's mistake. How did he know that that was his mistake? I don't know how. He was observing, or he knew him, or whatever. The water above heaven was not the same as the water below heaven. A radical change had taken place. The upper water was transformed into a substance designated marble stone. Therefore, it would be false to designate them by the same name. Hence, Rabbi Akiva's warning, do not say Mayim, Mayim. Okay, the third member of the group was Elisha ben Abuya. According to the version preserved by Harambam, the rabbis applied to him the verse, Devash masata echod dayeka pentispainu v'haketo. Eat only what you can, but less than sebi'ah, less than satiety, right? Because you never know your point of satiety if you're eating, strawberry shortcake. So you should eat, and Harambam says this in Hilchot De'ot, whenever you eat, don't eat to being satiated, eat to being less than it. Means he trespassed the boundaries of his understanding. Therefore, he cut some of the plants, to take a further look. The plants are the fundamental teachings or words of the Torah that are planted by the ancient Chachamim. Elisha ben Abuya, not only did he not further develop the plants, but he cut some of them out. He undid them. Means he made himself less intelligent than he was. He delighted his eyes with the esoteric vision, became lustful, and engaged in sexual promiscuity. We'll see in a moment. After exiting the orchard, he propositioned a prostitute to prove to her that he was no longer, or he wasn't, the famous scholar known as Elisha, because she recognized him. He uprooted a radish on the Shabbat and ate it, and she said, oh, it must have been Elisha Aher. That's why he's called Aher. So I'm just noting, a failed mystical vision brings up sexual lust, both in the imagination, like we saw with Ben Zoma, And I don't think I read it for you, but the other thing was, after he answers about the kalba, then they ask him, Sha'alu ben Zomah's second question. And here's an interesting question. What about a pregnant virgin? Can she marry a Kohen Gadol? Why would he be talking about a pregnant virgin? This is Roman Palestine. There are Christians at the time. Was there a myth that Christianity adopted? Yes, absolutely. The Mithra myth, where there's a pregnant virgin, gives birth to a god, but a man, a god, a man, all this kind of conflict. So Ben Zomah was sexual type archetypes arise in him. Elisha Aher leaves the vision and he's full of some kind of energy. He doesn't know what to do with it. It comes out in a sexual way. Here we see a similar thing. We have seen this movie before. You remember that the Shib'im Zekenim, including Nadab and Abihu, this is in Parashat Mishpatim, they saw God. They had a mystical vision of Borei Olam at post Har Sinai, or right afterwards. And they saw God, and lo and behold, under God's feet was a kind of sapphire brick. He's like, imagine bricks made out of pure, clear, radiant sapphire gems. And they were like clear, pure, like the light blue of the sky. That's a negative, because the next pasuk says, and nonetheless, to these princes of Israel, God didn't do anything. They saw God, a mystical vision, but they couldn't really bring it out properly. They did not yoseh beshalom, lo yaseu beshalom, unlike Rabbi Akiva. So they had to do something physical. They had to do something to satisfy a desire. So they ate and drank. So that's a similar thing. It was a negative. Some commentaries on the Chumash try to make apologetics. Don't believe them. That's what's happening here. Harambam makes a whole thing about this in the Moreh Nebuchim, I think part 1, chapter 5 or 6, maybe 7. You can find it there. I'm just going to read this last part about Aher. So Amar, so here's what happened. I won't translate everything, but I'll tell you more or less what happened. He has a vision where he sees Metatron, who is a malach, which in rabbinic thinking, he's kind of a messenger of Borei Olam. Sometimes you don't see God himself, but you see Metatron. Elisha Aher mistook Metatron not as a symbol symbolizing God, but as an independent entity. Like you take the symbol as something real, not unlike taking words and thinking they have power, because words really are only symbolic. You hear a word, it points to a concept in your mind. But some people, like some Mekubalim, think that if you recite the right Hebrew words, that does something, like the myth of Rumpelstiltskin. If you know the name, you have some power, right? Or the Sorcerer's Apprentice. If you can say the right word, you can have magical things happen, right? So he mistook the symbol of God for an independent entity, and he was tempted by what they call Shetei Shiot. That's a minor god and a major god. That's like a Persian idea, and so he got involved with that. He then heard, I think from the lesser god, from Metatron, he heard a bat kol that says, Aher can never do teshuvah. He made a mistake in thinking that was irrevocable. He misunderstood what it said. So, Amar, speaking about himself in the third person, after he left the Pardes, he says, well, now since that guy, meaning me, lost that world, means Olam Haba, lipok litnahe b'hai alma, I might as well enjoy this world. Nafak aher letarbut ra'ah. He went on to a horrible, tarbut ra'ah is a bad culture literally, but it means he was totally devolved. So he's chasing all over kind of physical pleasures. Nafak ashkah zona. The first thing he finds outside of the Pardes is a whore. He solicited her. Amira lehe Velav Elisha ben Abuya, aren't you Elisha ben Abuya? Akar Fugla Mimishra Shabbat. This must have been Shabbat, which makes sense. You would do the mystical vision in the Pardes on Shabbat. That's when people study Torah, they have time, etc. So he pulls up a radish growing from the ground, via Habla, and he gave it to her. Amira Aher, who she goes, the Elisha ben Abuya that I know would never pick. This is a mamash asur de oraita. I mean, that's koser. That's complete milacha. This Elisha ben Abuya would never do that. Must be Aher. This guy is somebody else who looks like him. That's the point. So the rabbis offered the following illustration. Mashal, a model to what may this be compared? To a royal orchard, there's the Pardes, having an upper chamber built on the top. What can a man do? Take a glimpse, providing that he would not nourish his eyes. Shelo yazin et ainav, from him. That's like a pure imaginary pleasure. You're not perceiving anything, but it looks like you're taking a peek. It looks like something good. You just can't stop eating the honey. The model conveys the lure present in esoteric discourse. Upon crossing into the orchard, one may choose a wrong perspective and fall prey, this should say fall, to the temptation of a forbidden insight insinuated by the expression yazin et aina. That's a forbidden pleasure. It's a purely imaginary one. This is what happened to Ben Zoma and Elisha Aher. Okay. So let's do this. This is the end of the first part, which is the Arba'ah Nechesul Pardes. So this is important, a little bit complicated, but very important. To illustrate the crossroads structuring this crisis, the crisis of entering the esoteric realm, the rabbis offered a second model. Rather than to tread on one of the paths lying ahead, charting, let's fix that, of a new path is required. In our terms, this means that the only way outside the orchard to leave Beshalom is through the realm of subjectivity, which is why I put the first slide up. Since subjectivity cannot be mediated, it cannot be constructed on the basis of someone else's knowledge or authority. Nobody can tell you what your subjective response should be. You have to step up and find it. By crossing into the orchard and looking at things from within, the student places himself outside the realm of objectivity. This is seeing the mystery of God and creation on his own. The crisis of absolute choice is bound up with the specific subjectivity of each individual. So just like Moshe Rabbeinu cannot tell Rabbi Akiva how to connect the Ketarim, nobody can tell anybody how to do that, how to have a mystical vision. There's no protocol. There's no content we can tell you. It's your content. It cannot be processed by a superior authority that would finish the student's unconcluded chapters. Because it cannot be structured on someone else's experience, it involves the final breach of the teacher-student relation. In this manner, direct perception and esoteric insight is effective. Do you ever see the movie The Karate Kid? If you study with me, you know I love it. So there's a point where in the beginning, before he starts studying karate, or just as he's starting, Mr. Miyagi, who's the teacher, does bonsai trees, those small Japanese trees that you train in a certain way. And although they're very small, they look like a big full-grown tree. That's an art. And so Mr. Miyagi says, Daniel says, he hands him the scissors, Mr. Miyagi, and Daniel says, I don't know what to cut. What should I cut? He's trying to ask the teacher how to make a tree, but in bonsai culture, the tree you cut is a reflection of your own individuality. Nobody can tell you what to cut. So Mr. Miyagi says, oh, Daniel-san, close the eye. See what you see. See tree? Open eye, now cut the tree. Mr. Miyagi doesn't even know what he saw, and he doesn't need to know, and he doesn't want to know. Daniel has to cut the tree that he sees. He can't try to cut the tree that Mr. Miyagi cut, even though he likes it. Same idea. The crisis of subjectivity involves charting a new road and treading upon a path that no one else has trod before. In this specific way, an esoteric insight is necessarily subjective, and subjectivity is necessarily esoteric. This principle is illustrated with a second model. They further presented another model. ve'od mashelu mashal, in the Tosefta. To what may this be compared? To a street leading to two paths, one of fire and the other of snow. If he would turn here, he would be consumed by the fire. If he would turn there to the other side, he would be consumed by the snow. But those are the only two paths that are out of the Pardes. What is one to do? He must walk in the middle of those two paths where there is no path. He's creating a path, providing that he would not turn either here or there. Okay. So now the rest of these slides are about Kabbalah. One point here, and this is why we ended on this slide, in the Arba'an Nesuda Pardes. The big fundamental difference between Rabbinic mysticism and Kabbalah is this. Kabbalah teaches you content. It tells you, it hands over the secret teachings. The Zohar is supposedly a bunch of secret teachings that you read. Whose subjectivity is being exercised? The author. The reader can't see esoteric insight that the author of the Zohar saw, or any other book, the Bahir, whatever you want to say. So that's a problem. That's how you know it's a whole different kind of mysticism than was ever existed before. Now, what is Kabbalah and where did it come from? So you have to know a little bit of history. From late antiquity throughout the Middle Ages, there were circles of Jews all over the Galut who were devoted to rabbinic learning. These circles were independent of the yeshivot in Babel. Some of the students were merchants whose travels brought them into contact with yeshivot and had the opportunity to become acquainted with the teachings and writings of the Geonim. Some may have actually attended the Babylonian yeshivot and then returned home before completing their studies. At one time, through the Kala institution, which I've spoken about before, the yeshivot exercised some supervision over these circles, although they were independent, kind of, let's study together kind of things all over the place. I mean, in Western Europe, we're talking about. With the waning of the yeshivot from the 9th century on, these contacts weakened. Consequently, in regions culturally and geographically distant from Babel, populist conceptions of rabbinic Judaism emerged in the realms of faith, spirituality, and cult. That means how you perform the rituals. Some of these developments had more to do with local folklore and sacrality than Torah. In fact, in his book Contra Judaios, Agobard, who was the Archbishop of Lyon, that's in southern France, southeast France, noted that French Jews believed in the corporeality of God and anthropomorphism. And the source of this, and in Ha'aye Gaon, is Tishavot HaGeonim HaHadashot. It's a book that came out about 15 years ago. He says clearly people holding this type of belief, corporeality of God, are minim. Now you know where Harambam got it. And we know there's a whole mahloka between the Abad. He has a note when Harambam says it that's very critical, but Ha'aye Gaon was the source. So now let's see. I don't think, okay. Okay, we'll just read the second paragraph. Already by the beginning of the 11th century, there were Talmudists in the Iberian Peninsula that opposed the intellectual traditions and values, making what later historians would designate the golden age of Spain. That's a Andalusian tradition. A second movement rose in Germany as a reaction to the First Crusades. In response to the atrocities committed in the name of religion by the Christians, Jews countered with the creation of a heroic ideology promoted by hymnologists, that's Paitanim, and chronicles under the rubric Kedoshim. Means they were about Kedoshim who actually were burned, who were martyred themselves. And there's a name you may have heard of called Bakon. It stands for, it's an acronym, Ben Kedoshim V'Nisrafim. So the descendants of those people who had died were venerated, right? This term, usually translated as saints, actually stood for heroes, with all the paraphernalia that European folklore attached to heroic behavior and ethos. This ideology spread south to France. The result was a new religious conception, which came to be known as Kabbalah. The ideology embodied in the Kedoshim literature is these very lengthy poems. Some of them are still recited in the Ashkenazi service of Kippur. If you've ever been to an Ashkenazi service on Kippur, I have several times. There are these, Musaf takes a very long time, and there are very long piyutim dispersed throughout the Musaf. Well, okay. Mass neurosis is contagious. The lunacy of the Crusaders, vented as religious devotion, resulted in the immolation of thousands of Jews. The impact on the mind of the victims was horrendous. Not just that many died, but the mentality that left, the trauma, the PTSD is like worse than being in Vietnam at the worst time of it. Imagine a soldier who comes back from Vietnam and he can't function anymore. The trauma is so great. That's what happened to them. Hazaton. Traditionally, Jews were exceptionally careful not to absorb their persecutors' ideology. But according to the hymnologists and chroniclers, this time things were different. If we are to believe these writers, the religious zeal of the Crusaders became paradigmatic of spiritual valor and determination in the mind of the victims. Those are the Jews. In their efforts to show that their own faith was second to none, some responded by murdering their own children to save them from apostasy and forced conversion. I went into this last time, you may recall. Instead of being commensurate, Jewish chroniclers and hymnologists portrayed these parents as well as their children as kedoshim, models to envy and emulate rather than assist with solving the trauma, to reintegrate them into a normal life. That's not what happened. They were heroicized and became a model for others. There's one piyut that has this value system in it called imafes. We read it in the Selechot, the Sephardim read it. I don't know if anybody else does. It's written by Yaakov in Regensburg, though, from the Rhineland. And it has very graphic, detailed descriptions of what Abraham was going to do to Yitzhak, which he never did, but what he was going to do. And I think it's trying to echo, they tried to connect the murder of their own children to Akedat Yitzhak somehow. Okay. At the beginning of what became known as Hasidei Ashkenaz, or the pious of Germany, in the Rhineland, the mystical element was sober, focusing primarily on the prayers and rituals. However, later, when Hasidut crossed over into southern France and Spain, things changed. Principally, rituals began to be perceived in terms of theurgical manipulations. That's where words have power, and if you say the right word, you can effect some cosmic effect up in the heavens. To justify this perception, a new religion was created under the general rubric Kabbalah. It's centered around the kind of cosmic sacrality that still lingered among peasants in Southern Europe, as well as on folklore and other miscellaneous. An important factor in the formulation of Kabbalah was the belief in the corporeality of God. That's why it was so tenaciously defended by the Ravad. Divine anthropomorphism, God has this, he's like this, he's like that, he wants this. You hear people today even say, what is God's will? You have no clue. There's no way to answer that question. You shouldn't even ask it. You don't know, and you will never know what God's will is. All you know is the berit. God said, do this berit, v'yitem mamlechet kohanim v'roy kadosh. That's basta. That should be enough. You don't need to know what God's thinking, because the word think doesn't even apply to God. That's a positive attribute. That's a projection, etc., noted by Agobard and the Karaites, both of whom noticed that the Rabbinites from Western Europe were anthropomorphic, and even the Karaim in Israel found this distasteful. Okay, I'm going to skip this thing, but if you want to read, there's someone named Lipman Badov who wrote a nice book about Kabbalah and the Rhineland experience. He thinks Kabbalah was a response to somehow cope with the PTSD of the First Crusade. Let's see. Oh, here's one point. Let's see. Okay, here's an important thing. There were decisive consequences. Oh, I'll start here. A major step in the promotion of Kabbalistic ideologies and the mystification of Jewish texts was reforming the synagogue. To make room for the long chanting of these hymns about martyrdom, etc., the recitation of the Targum was abrogated offhandedly, as if it were a trifle matter of little value. If you want to go more details, see Haham Faur's Horizontal Society, Appendix 61. There were decisive consequences to this reform, which deserve to be explained precisely because they remained unnoticed. If we are to come to grips with the strategic significance of this step, erasing the Targum, an adequate conception of the Kabbalistic ideology is essential, Briefly and to the point, this researcher Mirkia Eliad, who wrote a book called A History of Religious Ideas, he was a goy, described it as follows. To the sanctification of life by the medium of the work and rites prescribed by the Talmud, the Kabbalists added the mythological valorization of nature and man. What do you mean you mythologically valorize nature? Have you ever heard these parties where you say some berachot and you uplift the locus of the table or the chair or this plastic bottle? They exist, folks, they exist. Probably more people are doing that than studying Surata Dishmata in the Andalusian tradition, I guarantee it. It's unfortunate, but we got to have our eyes open. That's what you mean by mythological valorization of nature. A molecule of hydrogen peroxide doesn't have spirituality, whatever that means. So no matter how many incantations and how many berachot you recite, you're not going to uplift the spiritual madrega of hydrogen peroxide. It just is, what it is, right? The importance of mystical experience and even certain themes of Gnostic origin. One can discern in this phenomenon of opening and this effort at revalorization the nostalgia for a religious universe where the Hebrew scriptures and the Talmud coexist with a cosmic religiosity and with Gnosticism and mysticism. Basically, the Kabbalah introduced European Gnostic elements into Judaism, to say it the Kisur Nimras. And there's one more point, and this is important. Kabbalah appeared in the very places and at the exact time when the Maimonidean controversy was roaring, when the Rabbeinu Yonah Geronde and Ramban solicited the Franciscans in southern Spain, the Catholic priests, to burn the Sefer Mada and the Moreh Nevuchim of Harambam, which later led to them burning the Talmud. Generally, these subjects are studied separately. All right. Jewish heroic ideology penetrated the Iberian Peninsula in a three-pronged movement, three elements: anti-Maimonidean, Kabbalah, and rabbis of France. The latter usually referred to by these fancy terms. Generally, these subjects are studied separately, these three elements, as if they're disconnected from one another. Attention should be paid, however, to the fact that Spanish Kabbalah originated in the cities of Gerona and Barcelona, the hotbed of anti-Maimonidean activities. The link connecting these two movements, neglected by contemporary historians, is rabbis of France. That's a term that Haramban and Rabbeinu Yonah invoke repeatedly. The rise of this secret lore, noted the great historian Heinrich Gretz, coincides with the time of the Maimonistic controversy through which it was launched into existence. Here's the site right here. Okay, now I'm going to skip this, in a matter of time. Ramban believed that the very concept of religion rules out the admission of nature as an operative force. The world is affected by mysterious powers. The premature death of an embryo, for instance, is as wondrous as any of the miracles of Scripture. In both cases, the hand of God had directly intervened against nature. That is why belief in Torah should equal negation of nature. And you could read this later, but this is what he says more or less. Here's the mistaken premise of Ramban here. There is no nature. You can't say the word nature with a capital N in Hebrew. It entered Hebrew, teba, through Arabic. No one ever said nature, ever. We always attributed all what you call natural phenomena to Borei Olam himself. And as we now know through quantum mechanics and modern physics, there's some wiggle room. It's not, there is no determined universe. There's a probabilistic universe where the probabilities can change at any time God wants them to change. So we're just hanging there and nothing's determined. There's room. That Einstein could not accept that. He said, what do you mean, to Niels Bohr? God is playing dice with the universe. And Niels Bohr, who was also Jewish by his mother, said, who are you to tell God what to do? And that's really the Jewish answer. So according to Haramban, no one could believe in the Torah and the validity of nature at all. Here's what he says now. I am amazed at Maimonides, quipped Ramban, who minimized miracles and maximized nature. But once again, Harambam doesn't Doesn't believe in nature, as you say. This was also this dispute between David Nieto and some other people in the famous controversy around 1705, 1704, where he made a speech in Sha'ar HaShamayim in I think, London. And someone complained that he's attributing worshiping nature or something like that. It was a whole hullabaloo. But David Nieto was expressing the uncorrupted original Jewish view where there is no nature. So if we say Hamosi lechem min haaretz, then we attribute that to God. Okay, now let's see. Now we'll skip that. So Haramban has this thing about secret names of the Torah. That there's, well, I'll go back here. We have a tradition, Kabbalah, he says, that the entire Torah, from beginning to end, consists of magical names. The legible text was transmitted in writing by Moses to the people. The Hermetic subtext, comprising holy names, was transmitted to Moses orally. In every section of the Chumash, he wrote, there is the name by which that thing was created or made, or how that thing was realized, as if there's power in the name. If you know the name, you understand the creation of the thing the name points to. King Solomon's wisdom, too, came through the possession of these names. Likewise, Moses brought the 10 plagues and split the sea because of a special name that was revealed to him. Knowledge of a certain name will empower an individual to resurrect the dead. Another produces the secret miracles made for the pious. It is well known to many, he solemnly declared, that these names were used by the pious of the generations. In this fashion, the pious knew how to kill and to resurrect, to desolate and to destroy, to demolish and to annihilate, to build and to plant. He's paraphrasing here. So according to Harambam, and he's a good representative of the school of Kabbalah, certainly of Catalonia, where he lived, it's all in the names. It's all in the words. Words have power. We today, in the science of epistemology, there's a name for that, and it's called nominal realism. That a horse is called horse because it has an essential horsiness, and the name is almost precedes the actual thing. There was these names in the Platonic land of the ideal forms, and we figured out the names. And if you're from a barbaric culture, your word for horse is inferior. Okay, so we need to take a 5-minute break, and we have maybe 6 more slides, but I have to go now. Right now it's sunset in New Jersey, so I need to light the Nerot or Ner Hanukkah. So we'll take a 5-minute break, and I'll be right back. And then we'll finish, and that'll be that. Okay, so I'm going.
Thank you, Acham.
Going on mute until that happens. Well, I'll leave it. All right. Okay, and we're back. Let me
Thank you.
know.
We wanted to hear you recite the baracha. We were hoping we could hear you.
Oh, well, this is my office, and it has to be outside by the front door, so pretty far away. Sorry.
No.
Okay, are we ready to begin again? Or
Yes,
should
please.
Okay, good. Let's see. So we were just saying here that according to Haramban, the entire Torah is from beginning to end consists of magical names. So how come nobody ever heard of this before? There's no Masechet magical names, right? Moses transmitted the secret names to superior men who managed to pass them on through unbeknownst channels to the Hermetic circles in and around Catalonia. Haramban writes this in his introduction to the Pirush al-HaTorah. Eventually, this textuological approach affected the core concept and function of the liturgy. The prayer book was transfigured into a series of strategically placed series of conjurations made up of the rearranged consonants of the text, designed to maneuver and control the realm of the divine. Some conjurations have a comical flavor. The following is one example. By the way, have you ever heard of this thing called L'Shem Yehud? L'Shem Yehud Kudsha Berichu Shchinte. So that conceives of God as having two aspects. Now, if you ask, people will say, oh, it doesn't mean he's two parts, and so it doesn't violate Adonai Echad, which is both uniqueness and integration. He's like one being. He's not like us. He doesn't have lungs and adrenal glands and bladder and heart, and the heart doesn't have four chambers. God is nothing like that. So he doesn't have parts. So when we say Yehod v'Yehod, it means he's thoroughly integrated. Like he just is. There's no parts to him. There's no aspects. It just is what he is. And we cannot know that, right? And we have to admit that. So, but the Kabbalah posits that God has aspects. Some are male, some are female. This particular pair is Kudsha Berichu, that's like a male aspect of God, Ushchinte, and his Shekhinah, which is a female. And they need to be unified or reunited because there was a crisis at the time of creation where aspects of God were scattered. Lubavitch has a lot of this with they take things out of Kilipa. They said they took it out of Klipa, this kind of thing. The Habiyot, there was different barrels and barrels within barrels, like nested Russian dolls. They have all kind of theories. And so into especially the Sephardic tefillah, we have all these L'Shem Yehods, where we posit that if you do something correctly, or you recite a tefillah correctly, that God's male aspect, Kudsha Berichu, will be reunited with his Shekhinah, L'Shem Yehod, for the sake of uniting God and his Shekhinah. Now, here's my fundamental question that bothered me since I was a teenager. Who made the rules by which God is split and reunited? And why is some guy in some little town in the United States, at some tefillah, Arich al Shabbat, why is what he says in words do something cosmically that affects the very God we're purporting to pray to? Who we just got finished saying, Adonai Ahad. That was a conundrum I could not get my head around, and no one was able to answer it. So here's one of the conjurations that have a comical flavor. Dikar Nosa. You may have heard of this. It's in the Sephardic tefillah for Rosh Hashanah, a most solemn prayer pronounced at the end of most Sephardic services. But originally it was not at the S&P. I don't know what they do now. On the night of Rosh Hashanah, invokes the great and holy name Dikar Nosa, Laman Hashem Hagadol Ve'akadosh Dikar Nosa, that is supposedly encoded in the subtext of two scriptural passages. Now, pay attention. For the Kabbalist, the subtext of the Torah is like magical names, where you rearrange the same consonants to get the names. When in the first slide I put up tonight, the subtext of the Torah is something that somebody can connect to mitzvot or to apparently peripheral details of different mitzvot or pisukim to come up with something new, like Ezohi avodah shehu baleb zu tefillah, because ul obdo bechol lebabchem. That's a din mufla, by the way. That's what God was telling Rabbi Akiva. God was telling Moses about the midrash of Rabbi Akiva. So there's different ways of positing subtexts, and what you do with them. The Kabbalistic one is a set of secret names. Now, you're going to laugh if you don't know this. The holy name Bikar Nosa, this superlative magical name, is nothing more than the Spanish Dea Coronosa, or fleshy, probably in the sense of a portly goddess. Have you seen those ancient fertility goddesses? They look like fat women. They first discovered in the Semitic lands, right? So Dea Carnosa is a fleshy goddess. Let us not forget that until recently, only plump ladies were regarded as sexually attractive. On the influence of Kabbalah and the Sephardic liturgy, particularly after the expulsion, see the note of Stefan Reif, Judaism and Hebrew Prayer, and in this little book there. Okay, now, I want to tell you something very, very important. There's an academic and a religious myth. The doctrine of the Sefirot, which dominates the entire gamut of modern Sephardic prayers, rituals, and symbologies, has its origins in prior pre-Kabbalistic Jewish literature. That is the myth. And everybody who talks about the Kabbalah will tell you the following. The Sefirot that are described in the medieval French Sefer HaBahir, that's the first time that Sefirot in the Platonic sense, Platonic emanations. Why they're 10, I don't even think they know why there's 10. Maybe because just humans think in tens, which is an arbitrary thing, not a universal spirituality that was there before man ever came about, right? They connect the Sefirot of the Bahir with the Sefer Yetzirah, because the Sefer Yetzirah originally was written in the 2nd century, and it comes from the schools of the Chachamim. So they wanted to connect the two. Every modern historian, every rabbi I've ever heard talk about it, says that the Sefirot in the Bahir are the same as the Sefirot in Sefer Yetzirah. So you see, it's a very ancient idea. It's not. Mekubalim prayed during the Amidah for some berachot to one Sefirah, and for other berachot to another Sefirah. And you want to know the details, look in Teshuvot Harivash, famous Hacham from northern Spain, later went to North Africa, number 157. In Sefer Yetzirah, a book commented upon by Maimonideans, such as Se'adya Gaon and Yehuda Bar Gelone, a Sefirah, just as the English word cipher denotes numerals. Sefer Yetzirah speaks of 32 paths of wisdom. These are the 22 consonants of the Hebrew language and the 10 ciphers of the decimal system, beginning with 0. By the way, in old America, and especially in rural areas like in Tennessee and Kansas and Oklahoma, when you went to school in the 1800s, like Little House on the Prairie, they taught you ciphering, which was their word for mathematics or arithmetic. They called those ciphers, and you learn how to cipher. Comes from the Arabic word zifr, which means 0. There are 22 consonants. So this is all arbitrary, though. There are only 32 paths of wisdom if you're speaking to people who speak a Semitic language and who use the decimal system. If you're talking to the Mayas, which may have many more or less consonants, and certainly many more numbers. I think they have 59 because they are a sexagesimal, not a decimal, but a sexagesimal number system. Then you would have 98 paths of wisdom. It's arbitrary, right? It's not, as they say in Yiddish, geboit in the oilem. It's not internal part of the inner mechanism of the universe, right? Okay. Does it make sense, though, to pray to a numeral, like something like, now I'm channeling that guy, Norm MacDonald, Alav HaShalom, he died recently, but does it make sense to pray to a numeral? 06, so we'll go something like this. 06, ye of great evenness and incorporating 2 fundamental odds, save my wretched soul. And you can make nice tefillot to 8, to 99, whatever you like, right? So that's praying to the Sefirot. So Sefer Yetzirah was originally written in the 2nd century, but our version dates from the 7th. Sefer Yetzirah states that the Aser Sefirot stand on Belima, which is a compound word of Beli and Ma, without and what? It means without anything. This is describing nothing more than 0, without which there can be no infinite sequence of numbers. That's why the Romans got stuck because they couldn't count to more than 1,000 or a couple of thousand, right? The decimals, and if you have 0, you can have an infinite sequence of numbers, and you can quantify any relationship between data values. Like you want to compare the wavelength of light, which is in nanometers, 10 to the minus 9, to the size of the universe, which or a light year, which is God knows what, 10 to the 25. You can get you can get your head around the relative size if you have 0. If you don't have 0, which is just a marker for no number there, but that's the place, you can't count. The decimal system thus starts, as do all sequences in modern computing, with 0 and ends with 9. In computers, you don't go 1, 2, 3, 4. You go 0, 1, 2, 3, right? And you never have 10, right? For Rabbinic Judaism, reality is intelligible to humans, but only if both words and a quantifying language, mathematics, are used. The 10 sefirot of the Yetzirah refer not to Platonic emanations, as in the Bahir, which if you look very carefully, no one controls it. Although God is somehow emanating in various layers down to man from up in the Ein Sof, he can't control it. It's not like he created the emanations. It's kind of part of the godly system. Now you're getting all this double talk that starts to sound a lot like multiple aspects and multiple gods, right? We can explain energy and light as concepts, but we cannot explain a speed or express how matter is convertible to energy in mere words. You need both words and concepts and math to say E equals mc squared, right? And C itself requires numbers. Let's see. Let's go to this one. Concerning the divine name Elohim, Rabbeinu Bachya bar Asher. You've all heard of it. Rabbeinu Bachya is a nice pirush on the Humash. He was a student of Ibn Adrete, Harishpa. We've all heard of him. He explained the following. And there's a problem with these Hachamim, these Christian Spanish Hachamim. On one page, they'll say something nice. And on the other page, they'll say something very anti-Maimonidean. And to reconcile the two with, let's say, Ha'aya Gaon or Rabbeinu Hananel is impossible. And you don't know what to do. And I was 13 years old when I went to the Denver Yeshiva, which is in the Lakewood system. And they keep telling me about all these great Sephardics. They would say Sephardi, these Sephardi, Meforshim on the Talmud. Most of those Meforshim from the Rishonim are Sephardim. You should be proud. But when you look at it, they're all from Christian Spain, and they all pass the underlying trauma or the underlying belief system, which in many ways undoes the very Torah that they're trying to comment on. And it's a circular, never resolved internal contradiction. So here's something Rabbeinu Bachya says about the divine name Elohim. Rabbeinu Bachya explains, according to the Kabbalah, this name comprises two words, El plus Him. They are God. And this they are encoded in the Yod of Elohim, because it's usually spelled with a Yod there, which in Hebrew numerical value stands for the number 10. So they 10, meaning the Sefirot, are God. Abraham Abul Afia, perhaps the most serious mystic of the time, also from Christian Spain, reproached Ibn Adrete Harishpa for sponsoring such a doctrine. And he wrote the following. Accordingly, let me point out to you that the masters of Kabbalah and Sefirot believed to profess monotheism and tried to elude the Trinitarian doctrine of the Christians. In fact, they ended making him 10, just like the Gentiles professing he is 3 and the 3 are 1. Some Kabbalists say the divinity is 10 Sefirot and the 10 are 1. This is in a rather very rare book called Ginzeh Chochmat Kabbalah. It's a collection of essays about Kabbalah. Why is it so rare? Because it presents in some ways the pro-Maimonidean view, which was suppressed. There's no question about it. It was suppressed. The point made by a rationalist, probably a Maimonidean, is abundantly clear. And this is quoted in the Teshuvot of the Rivash, again, Ishaq Bar Sheshat, 157. Whereas the Christians believe in the Trinity, the mystics believe in the Tentary, which is the 10 Sefirot. So here's our last slide. So, Sof Davar Kol Nishma, what are we saying here? Responding to their own spiritual bent, modern historians refrain from pointing at the connection between the triumph of the anti-Maimonideans, the rise of Kabbalah, and mass conversions to Christianity. For those of us who did remain Jewish, the centuries following, and prior to even, but following for sure, the expulsion have seen significant changes to the tefillah. You may not know this, but in the Kiddush of Friday night, of Leil Shabbat, we erased the words Kibano Baharta ve'otanu kiddashta mikol ha'amim. If you hear an Ashkenazi sing the Kiddush on Friday night, he says that word, those words. We don't, because the numbers of the first paragraph of the Kiddush are supposed to equal the numbers of words of the second part of the Kiddush after, Boreh Fri HaGefen. And so Mekubalim took out that pasuk. But that was part of the matbea, that was part of the coined phrasing that the Hachamim created when they created the Kiddush. So, and many, many, many other changes like that. Okay. To halacha, all kinds of different things, like you can't wear tefillin on Holosh al-Mo'ed. You have to take off the tefillin for Musaf of Rosh Chodesh because you're going to say the word Keter Yitnu Lecha. The creator of the entire universe with its 4 trillion plus planets and the dark matter we just heard about 30 years ago and really don't even understand. He's confused because you say the word Keter Yitinu Lecha and you're wearing tefillin when he himself said you should wear tefillin all day. It's unfathomable, right? And it's fine if you want to do that. But what the problem is, if you don't want to follow the new strictures, let's say you want to keep your tefillin on Musaf of Rosh Chodesh, everybody gets nervous. So not only most of the people don't do the mitzvah properly. If any small minority wants to do it properly, they get hammered, right? This is all a direct result of the Maimonidean controversy and the victory of the anti-Maimonideans. And I've said many times, Maimonidean in this sense doesn't mean anything directly to do with Maimonides. He just happens to be the last spokesman for this tradition, which starts in the Emoraim and the Tanaim and the Geonim, etc., and moves over to Spain and North Africa. So that's more or less the end. I just have one little piece. If you know about what Hanukkah is, it was about the victory of a small faction of Jews in a civil war against the system. Mattatya and his sons, he was not one of the famous Kohen Gadol families. He was a guy in Modi'in, which was not far from, but it wasn't part of the insiders or the elites running the temple and running Yerushalayim, etc. And he couldn't take it anymore. He couldn't take, you have a bust of Zeus there, and he couldn't take the Jewish, not the Greek, the Jewish faction, which is the majority, who wanted to Hellenize us, who wanted us to be more philosophical and universal. And those are the people who did a surgical operation to undo their milah. So they would bring the, you have a milah, there's a piriyah, so the skin kind of like squeezed together below the crown of the penis. There's a surgical operation you can do to pull that forward again and make it look like you're in a harel. They did that. Kohanim running the temple, some of them did that. And they built a stadium opposite Har HaBayit, maybe it was on Har HaZetim, I don't know, and they would have Olympics. Jews, organized by Jews. No one told them they had to do it. No Greeks came and forced them. They just did it. They wanted to do it. And they would run, Greek Olympics were in the nude originally. That's why they did the Hamshachat Orlatam, the surgical operation. It's called, they pulled down back their orla, their foreskin, the remnant, so that they could run and do Olympics and do all kinds of Greekized things. That was a civil war. It's a civil war. The best description is by Elias Bickerman, who was a professor at both Columbia and the Jewish Theological Seminary. There's a great book, a gem, edited by Yehuda Golden, called The Jewish Experience. You can get it for $5, paperback, maybe $8. And one of the essays is by Elias Bickerman. It's called The Maccabean Uprising, an Interpretation. And he describes how it was a civil war. So what we all do with this knowledge that I've tried to impart to anybody who's interested in these classes involves a crossroads, just like there's a crossroads when you enter the Pardes. Some would call it a crisis. Just like the issues facing Matatyahu and his sons, the answer is not to be found in any authority or even in the conventional institutions. Nobody can tell you what the path out of this is, or even whether there's a need for a path out. That's, you have to notice that yourself. We must chart, perhaps, a new path and water, once again, the young plants planted long ago that have not been tended to in a very long while. So Hanukkah Allegre, thank you all for your kind attention. I know it's a little deep and dense. If you take my slides and you study them, Ba'ayun, several times, all of the bits of information I've tried to weave together will come to you in a nice orderly fashion. All I can do is point to things. So let's see if there's any kushiot or ba'ayot. Let's see, chat, okay, chat. Nope. So it looks like we're good. Oh, yeah, thank you very much. Okay. So everybody have a Hanukkah Allegre, and I think my next Habura classes is next year sometime, either in March or in May. So until then, we'll see you.
Acham, thank you so much. And quickly on that point, we were talking about how it's impacted prayer. The first baracha, L'adlik ner shel Hanukkah, as you know, the Ben Ish Chai introduced that we remove the shell.
Yes.
The Gemara and Harambam and the Rif all include, obviously, L'adlik ner shel Hanukkah, and I believe the Ashkenazim also include.
Yes, absolutely right.
And the S&P, I was very pleased to see the S&P Sidur, it includes shell.
Good.
And it is our custom.
So if you want to know what some of the old tefillah was before Kabbalistic enhancements, you look at the Ashkenazi, not Minhag Sfarad, but Nosach Ashkenaz itself, and let's say the Sidur Aram Saba, or the Yemenite, or the Bene Israel, which are very close to each other. That will show you what it was like in the Musta'arab world before the expulsados, the people who were expelled from Spain, came back to the East and started fiddling with the text of the Tefillah. So yes, absolutely right. Had I been on the microphone, you would have heard Shel Hanukkah, of course.
Yes, indeed. And likewise in my home.
Very good.
Thank you, Acham. Very, very, very helpful. And I can't wait to do Hazara. So please do send over the PDF or the presentation. And Hanukkah Allegre, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Okay, bye-bye, everybody.
Yeah, bye-bye. Until next time.
Let's see.